In this video, I want to talk about one of my favorite baits, which is the Whopper Plopper and or the Choppo. These are topwater baits that can catch a lot of fish and they can catch some really big fish. And kind of in this time of the year, kind of this late summer and all the way into fall, I throw ploppers a lot. So I thought I would tell you about 5 different tips that I have when it comes to fishing these baits, things that I think will help you become a better fisherman, a better plopper fisherman, and also just catch more of the fish that bite. Now, before we get into the video, this one is brought to you by my apparel company, Finn Fishing. Right now, for the month of September, which is actually, it ends tonight. This is the last day of the sale. You can actually get a USA made sun shirt and a pair of sun gloves for 60 bucks. So it's basically like getting an extra pair of sun gloves for an extra $6. So it's a really good deal. The sun gloves are one of the most popular products that I sell on the website. And usually I'm a little bit low on stock. And right now I have a pretty good stock. And so right now you can get a USA made sun shirt and the sun gloves for 60 bucks. All you gotta do, add the sun shirt you like to cart, add the gloves that you like to cart, it will automatically discount at checkout. I greatly appreciate all of you who have supported Finn Fishing in the past. All right, let's talk about ploppers. I absolutely love these baits. They are so much fun. When you get on a good plopper bite, I always feel like I am targeting some of the biggest bass that live in the lake. Now, with that being said, if you ever go down the topwater aisle at your local store or you look online, what you will find is that there are a number, if you think about the plopper and the choppo, there's a lot of different sizes of these baits. There's a lot of different colors of these baits. And I think that the first thing that's really important to understand is kind of the differences in these baits. And the biggest thing that I really want to talk about is actually on the Whopper Plopper size, because the Whopper Plopper, you actually have several different sizes. I'm not even going to mention all of them. They're just the ones that I throw the most. I throw the 130. I probably throw the 110 the most. This is the 130. You can see it's a little bit bigger. Right here, you actually have the 90. And then you actually have, I believe this is a 75. Yeah, 75 right here. You also have some bigger. You have like a 180. So there's a lot of different sizes. Now, the one thing that I really wanted to point out is that when it comes to all of these baits, besides the 90, and we'll talk about the 90 in just a minute here, the biggest difference in the size of these baits and the action that they make is really just the size. It's just the profile of the bait. And a lot of times, the bigger a profile I can get away with, that's what I like to fish, because I just feel like you will catch some really big fish on those big ploppers. So a lot of times I'm gonna throw the 130 or the 110 to kind of start. And if I start getting on a good plopper bite, I will experiment with the size to see. Sometimes simply jumping up to a big size, you're gonna get bigger than average bites. Sometimes jumping down a size to for example, the 75, you may not get necessarily bigger bites, but you start to get a lot more bites. The other thing that I've realized when it comes to the size of the baits that you throw is that sometimes bass will hook up better with one size or another. And I've seen it swing both ways. I've seen sometimes where the little ones, they hook up with really well. I've seen sometimes where the big ones, they hook up really well. So when it comes to picking out a size of the bait, I always tell people, start with the 110. It's a good kind of average size Whopper Plopper. It makes a good noise out there. It's not too big, it's not too small. It catches a lot of fish. And from there, you can kind of experiment with size. Now, I set the 90 to aside. And the biggest reason is that the 90 is a very different Whopper Plopper when it comes to all these Whopper Ploppers. And the biggest thing is that it makes a very different sound than the plopper. For example, I have a 75, which is technically smaller than the 90 in my hand right here, but the 75 actually makes a pretty aggressive plopping noise. So really, it makes an aggressive noise. It's just in a very compact size. The 90, on the other hand, makes a lot more of a subtle noise. It's not as an aggressive plop. And I've seen days, man, where bass really like this 90 size. If you fish in a lot of highly pressured situations, which I know I do here a lot in Ohio, but I've seen this in other places, even down in Tennessee, you know, where there's just a lot of people throwing topwater baits. I've seen where the 90 will dominate. So That's one of the biggest things to always take in consideration. I always have a couple of 90s tied up or ready to go, at least because of how much of a different sound that they create. I think it's really important to just understand that. All right, now let's talk about colors. Colors are very, very simple in my mind. I have really kind of three main colors, and they're kind of similar to everything that I throw in bass fishing. Like when it comes to topwater baits, these are what I like to go with. Basically, I'm gonna have a shad imitating bait, and it could look something like this where it's kind of bone in color. It could also be something like this where it's a little bit more translucent. I tend to just use the translucent ones when I'm fishing a lot clearer water. These are more for a stained water application or really cloudy conditions. You may be fishing really clear water, but it's very cloudy outside. I like that bone color in that type of situation. If I know that the bass are eating shad, I don't know that it always matters anyways. The other thing that I like to have is a black one. This is actually a Berkeley Choppo right here. And it's, as you can see, it's just black. Black can be a really good color. I've seen it work both in the daylight and when it's overcast conditions. I tend to use it a little bit more in dark conditions, but I've seen it work, you know, in both. And I don't always know that it matters. Sometimes it doesn't matter. Now, if the bass I know are eating bluegill, I like to have a bluegill style pattern. Usually that's with either a little bit of red or orange on the throat, like this one here. Just remember that the bass really only see the belly of these baits. So that's the most important thing. So I like a bluegill type pattern with a little bit of red or orange on the throat. I like a shad type pattern, and then I like a black. That's pretty much it. That's all that I think really matters. Okay. So now we know a little bit about the size of the baits and the different sounds they make. We know a little bit about the colors I like to throw. Let's go on to the next tip, which is actually the way that you bring these in. This is the third tip. Now, there are a lot of days on the water where all you have to do to catch fish on a whopper plopper is cast that thing out and reel it back in at kind of a steady pace. Now, I always believe that you should impart a little bit of action here and there with every bait that you fish. And it's no different than when you're fishing a whopper plopper. And the biggest thing that you can do with a whopper plopper is simply kill it. Every now and then I have seen where you're bringing this bait in and you just kill it. In the middle of a cast, just completely stop that bait. And sometimes bass will hit it when it's paused. Other times it's directly after you restart it. So you'll be bringing it through the water, you'll kill it, and I think a lot of times a bass will track that thing and bam, they get right below it, and then all of a sudden you start it up again, that is when they hit it. I have also seen where a subtle pop of the rod tip, you're bringing this bait in, I do this a lot with buzz baits as well. I'm bringing the bait in and all of a sudden I just kind of raise the rod tip, or I'll crank it really fast, and all it does is it spits water a little bit, it speeds that bait up for just a split second, and then you kind of continue on the retrieve. Those two things, pausing it and popping it, I think can make a world of difference on certain days. It's not always a difference, but there are definitely days out there in those highly pressured situations or around fish that you know have seen a lot of whopper ploppers where those little subtle pops and pauses can help you to get a lot more bites. Maybe twice as many bites as you would get normally just casting the bait out and reeling it in. Now again, that's not always the case. This is fishing, and sometimes we are just fishing for dumb fish, and it just doesn't matter what you do and what your retrieve is, they're gonna hit it. The other thing that I like to experiment when it comes to the retrieve a little bit is the speed. Sometimes you can get away with having a very aggressive retrieve where you're casting this thing out and you're really reeling it back pretty fast to the boat or even on the land. I love when the fish are hitting it that way, because typically when they're hitting it that way, they are very aggressive and you can cover so much water. There are also days where you're pretty much just keeping that prop on the back of this thing moving. So you're kind of reeling it a little bit on that medium slow pace and just keeping this thing moving, and you will find days where the bass like that. So it all comes down to experimenting. You know, there's no do this on certain days, do that on certain days. even like I said, with the colors, you know, like I like white with fish that are eating shad. I like that bluegill kind of imitation on bluegill eating fish, but it doesn't always matter. Like it just doesn't always matter, especially with a whopper plopper that just puts off so much of a weird, unorthodox noise that I don't even think bass half the time think that. I think the bass are just like, what the crap is that? And that's why they hit it. So anyways, that is the third thing that I want to tell you. Now, the fourth thing that is very, very important when it comes to this bait is the hooks. Like I think that the hooks that come on the whopper plopper are a little bit too thick. And I'm not gonna say that they're always too thick. If you're fishing for some really big bass and you have kind of the tackle that we'll talk about here in just a minute, having those thicker hooks can be good. But I don't really like to set the hook that hard when I'm fishing a whopper plopper, because if you miss a fish, you got this thing coming back at you pretty quick. I really just kind of like to let that rod load. And so I actually switch out the hooks a lot on my whopper plopper. The ones that come on the plopper, the river to sea, like hooks, they're pretty dang thick hooks. Like they just are. And sometimes it can be hard to penetrate into a fish's mouth, especially if you are fishing for smaller than average fish. And I know that none of us like to say, hey, we're fishing for smaller than average fish. But look, I'm from Ohio. There are times where you go to fisheries in Ohio and you're chasing after 2-pounders. Like a 2-pounder is a good fish. If you're fishing for a lot of those 1.5 pound, 2 pound fish, they do not have enough weight that when you set the hook, sometimes you won't penetrate that well into their mouth because they don't have enough resistance on the other end. On a big fish that has a lot of weight, it's a little bit easier to drive that big hook in because they have enough weight going the opposite direction. I'm not sure if I'm making sense of that enough. And I know that some of you are like, well, dude, I only fish for big fish. Well, that's great for you. You're not me. And sometimes in Ohio, we just fish for smaller fish. So I like to switch the hooks out to something that's just a little bit thinner diameter. Now, with that being said, you have to be careful not to go too thin of a diameter hook. You want a quality hook when it comes to whopper plopper fishing because of the tackle that you fish it on. And that's what I want to talk about. This is the fifth thing. The tackle to me is very, very important. The most important thing is the rod. I like to have a composite rod, kind of a similar rod that I fish a lot of my topwater baits with when I'm fishing the whopper plopper. A lot of anglers, when they first discover the whopper plopper, they were told to use flipping sticks for this bait. And look, that will work sometimes, and I think it worked better back in the day because the bass were hitting whopper ploppers so aggressively that you could get away with using a flipping stick because they just got it so good, and they had never heard anything like it. Nowadays, I really like to, it's a treble hooked hard plastic bait. I like to have a composite rod. I throw it on my chatterbait rod. My chatterbait rod is a composite. It's half glass, half graphite rod. It's a 7-foot, 4-inch rod. It handles the weight of the whopper plopper, and I use usually 30 or 40 pound braid with that bait in a 7.1-to-1 gear ratio reel. So to me, because you're using braid, that's why you need to make sure you don't go too thin of a wire hook. Because if you're like me and you like to set the hook hard and you have a thin wire hook and you have braid, you'll straighten that hook out. So there's definitely a fine line there. I'm not saying that you real quick, if you're new to bass fishing, I'm not saying that you absolutely have to switch out the hooks on your bait because I don't want to overwhelm you guys. But the more and more whopper plopper fishing you are doing, I think that you will see that switching those hooks out to a little bit thinner wire hook will just help increase your hookups and your landing ability of the fish. All right, I felt like I just said a lot in a little bit of time. Those are my tips for whopper ploppers. Hope you guys enjoy, and I will see you guys tomorrow.